Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Natalie Kay, and I'm a program officer here at the National Endowment for Democracy, focusing on our Zimbabwe Grants program. It's an honor for me to be able to moderate this discussion today on behalf of the International Forum for Democratic Studies. Our topic today is Elections in Zimbabwe, Autocracy and Stasis, or Democracy and Change. And it will feature a presentation by our Reagan-Fascell Democracy Fellow, Dr. Alex Magaisa. And we're delighted to also have with us as a discussant, Dr. Alexander Noyes, Senior Associate of the Africa Program at CSIS. Funded by the U.S. Congress, the Reagan-Fascell Democracy Fellows Program hosts some of the world's most dedicated democracy activists, scholars, and journalists to conduct independent research and pursue projects here at NED. Now in its 17th year, the program has hosted more than 270 fellows from over 90 countries since its founding in 2011. Within this remarkable group, our speaker today stands out for his unwavering commitment to the struggle for democracy in Zimbabwe. In his presentation, Alex will consider the struggle to achieve greater democratic accountability in today's Zimbabwe. As many of us know, for the past few decades, Zimbabwe has been going through a protracted struggle for democratization. Democrats have met resistance and repression from the ruling ZANU-PF party, which has been fortified by an entrenched political military network. This network, however, underwent a serious rupture last November when former allies effectively deposed the longtime leader, President Robert Mugabe. The new president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, has promised reforms, and general elections have been scheduled for July 30th, just a few weeks from today. Needless to say, the upcoming polls present dramatically new political dynamics and opportunities, and the world is watching these elections. I'll leave it to Alex to take us through the political environment and give his analysis. His presentation, followed by Alex Noyes' response, will assess the preparations for these elections, and they will discuss the prospects for democratization, including possible post-election scenarios and the roles of the military and the international community. So first, let me briefly take you through our speakers' bios. Dr. Alex Magaisa is a prominent Zimbabwean lawyer and constitutional expert, currently teaching law at the University of Kent. Between 2012 and 13, he was chief of staff and principal advisor for Morgan Tsvangirai, who was Zimbabwe's then prime minister as part of a coalition government. And he was leader of the Movement for Democratic Change in DCT, which was the country's main opposition party. From 2011 to 12, he served as a key advisor for COPAC, which was the parliamentary committee that wrote Zimbabwe's new constitution that was approved by referendum and signed into law in 2013. He's also the author of a widely acclaimed blog offering in-depth analysis of law and politics in Zimbabwe. Dr. Alexander Noyes is a senior associate with the Africa Program at CSIS, an adjunct political scientist at the RAND Corporation, and adjunct research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analyses. During his doctoral studies, he carried out extensive research in Zimbabwe, and he's recently returned from Zimbabwe, where he participated in a pre-election assessment mission. So we will now turn the floor over to Alex Magaisa, who will speak for approximately 25 minutes, and then our other Alex will speak for about 10 minutes. If you've not already done so, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. And for those of you on Twitter, you can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents. And you can follow the forum at ThinkDemocracy and the endowment at NEDemocracy. Finally, let me take this opportunity to thank the many staff members that were part of putting this event together today, especially Kabod Mensa, who was essential in providing assistance to Alex during his fellowship and putting together this presentation. So, take it away, Alex.
Very often, when I have introduced myself as a Zimbabwean, as many of my fellow Zimbabweans here who are in this audience who testify, the first question that we often get relates not to our country or its people, but to an individual. And that individual was Robert Mugabe, who was the president until last year. The question was always, so how is Mugabe? And we had to find an answer to that question. It's a question that we don't have to answer these days because, as many of you now know, Mr. Mugabe is now an ordinary private citizen, having left power in November last year in circumstances that I will describe briefly during the course of my presentation. First of all, I thought that it would be useful. Natalie has already done a great job describing who I am and what I have supposedly done over the last few years. I will just say a few words as part of my introduction into my story, who I am. The picture that you see, you might be wondering what it is all about. Many years ago, when I went to work with Morgan Tsvangirai, I had a meeting with one of his very good friends after a few weeks, and he said to me, Alex, now that you are here, you have to understand that you either stay on the balcony or you join the dance floor. And he says, you have come now from the UK and now you are in Zimbabwe, so in the broader sense, you are now on the dance floor. A lot of things are going to happen. They are going to say so many nasty things about you. They are going to arrest you perhaps, and things are going to be very difficult. But at the same time, within this office, the Prime Minister's office, you don't have the luxury to be on the dance floor. You have to stay up there in the balcony and be able to see what's going on. And he always used to warn me, Magaisa, they are dragging you to the dance floor. Please stay up in the balcony. So my story has been the story of either being on the balcony or on the dance floor. So between 2010 and about 2014, I was, in the broader sense, on the dance floor in Zimbabwean politics. Before then and after that, I was and I am somehow in the balcony, although I have to say that sometimes I do take steps downwards, closer to the dance floor, just to see what's going on, just to get the experience before moving back up again on the balcony. So that has been the story of my life, and I thought that it best illustrates the roles that I've taken, both as a scholar in the academy, but also as an activist, as someone who works with the democratic movement, works with civil society, and engages with the public in many different ways. So a few things that I've been involved in, and that Natalie has already pointed out. The picture in the middle, Democrats, is a DVD. During the time that the Constitution was made, between 2009 and 2013, there was a Danish documentary maker who was there taking all the scenes, and there is a film which you can watch on Netflix. It's called Democrats. I think Mugabe and the Democrats, a fascinating take, a fascinating indication into how the Zimbabwean Constitution was made, and I do make a cameo appearance in it. The picture on the right at the top, you can see that's me with Morgan Tsvangirai and another colleague. We were visiting the World Economic Forum some years ago. At that time, I was Morgan Tsvangirai's Chief of Staff and Advisor. And the picture below is a more recent picture. Many of you perhaps don't quite know who the young man is, but he is is Nelson Chamisa. He's the guy who is one of the two main candidates in this year's election on 30 July, and leader of the MDC Alliance. And I was in Harare in April this year, and we had some time to catch up. We are old friends from university many years ago. So I've been with the National Endowment for Democracy for the past 4 to 5 months now. We've had a fantastic time here as a fellow. And part of my time is spent writing what we call the Big Saturday Read. It's a bit of not a very humble name, but essentially it came out of a lot of discussions with friends. I used to write every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and they said, look, Alex, maybe you need to create one big iconic page, just call it something. And I thought I could call it the Long Saturday Read, but it didn't sound quite right. And we had a few drinks, and then I said, why don't we call it the Big Saturday Read? And it became the Big Saturday Read. And so that's the blog that I write every Saturday. It has a fair amount of followers, some who take offense if I don't publish it. It's become, it's a passion, but it has also become somewhat an obligation. So that's me and the kind of work that I do. My motivation with the Big Saturday Read, my motivation with the writing, is essentially because I've always believed that politicians like to mystify things, and they often do so using the law. And my job or my task, my mission, is to demystify the law, to demystify politics. I'm not a political scientist at all, and I just try to look at how the law is used in order to achieve political purposes, and how to make people understand what the law means and how to make it easier and more accessible to the people. So, the current situation. The current situation in Zimbabwe. I would say that Zimbabwe is a country that is undergoing a transition, a very difficult and protracted transition, which reached perhaps one of the high watermarks in November 2017, when there was a coup. A lot of people have difficulties with this word. Other people like to simply call it a military intervention. Others like to call it a military-assisted transition. And others like to be more direct and just call it what it is, a coup. It was the processes where the military in Zimbabwe took, in some ways, an unprecedented step and intervened very boldly, taking charge of the national broadcaster and announcing that Mr. Mugabe was safe. They were only targeting criminals around him, apparently. And Mr. Mugabe, eventually after a week, he left power, he resigned. He was going through a process of impeachment, and he would have been impeached, and so he decided to jump. But effectively, he was pushed out of power. February 14th, Mugabe's major rival for the past 20 years was a man called Morgan Tsvangirai, a tenacious fighter for democracy. I worked with him. He was an honorable man, and he fought hard for democracy in Zimbabwe, one of the iconic figures of that struggle. He unfortunately was diagnosed with cancer of the colon in 2016, and despite efforts to treat it, he could not make it, and he died on the 14th of February 2018. His death, unfortunately, sparked a power struggle within the MDC, within the opposition movement, and the person who emerged as you could say, the winner, or the person with the larger part of the MDC was Nelson Chamisa, who became the MDC president. Nelson Chamisa was assisted also by the fact that he was backed by the alliance which Morgan Tsvangirai had put together, an alliance of about 7 parties. The rival, Thokozani Kupe, who was one of the vice presidents in the MDC, continued to assert her power and authority in the MDC, and is also her own group, which also trades by the same name, the MDCT, and is also contesting in the election. So there is a bit of a challenge there in the opposition movement in that there is that split. The election date was announced on the 30th of May, which means that the election is going to be held on the 30th of July. The MDC had an important demonstration on the 5th of June. Essentially, this was a political action which was designed to put pressure on the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, which is the electoral body, the referee in Zimbabwe's elections. The belief being that the ZEC, as I shall call it during this presentation, is not a fair umpire, and it needs to It needs to get its act together. There was a joint statement by the NDI and IRI on June the 8th, which was a pre-election assessment or a report on the pre-election environment in Zimbabwe. They pointed out some of the positives that had taken place, but also pointed out some of the areas that needed improvement. On July 4, just a few days ago, Zimbabwe's military issued a statement through its public relations director, essentially indicating that whatever happens in the election, they would be guided by the Constitution. Now, those of you who have read my Big Saturday read of last week will remember that I've been rather critical of this statement because it doesn't really say anything. Because on the one hand, what the military did in November 2017, they also claimed that they were guided by the Constitution, but they essentially intervened in the political arena. There is nothing to suggest that if the same situation or similar situations presented themselves again, they could easily take the same approach and say that whatever actions they are taking in order to intervene in politics would also be guided by the Constitution. The European Union observers who are in Zimbabwe right now issued a statement on Friday last week, on July 6th, and although they also pointed out some of the positives they were seeing, they were also quite critical of some of the issues they felt that there could be improvement. In particular, the actions of ZAC and how it could improve the electoral environment in Zimbabwe in order to produce a credible outcome. And so we await. It's a few days to go before the election on July 30, and things are holding up. Tomorrow, the MDC is going to hold another big demonstration, so you'll probably be seeing this in the news. They are continuing to protest at the approach of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. The key actors in Zimbabwe's election, I put them up there with their monikers. Emmerson, the crocodile, Mnangagwa, as he is known. This is a name that derives from his time during the liberation struggle. He is the incumbent and former Mugabe right-hand man. He was essentially his assistant from the days of the war until 2017 when Mugabe was deposed. And in fact, Mugabe fired him a few weeks before he was deposed, and then he came back and he became the president. Nelson Wamba, Chamisa, people ask me where does he get this name from. I don't know if there are any Congolese people here. They probably know someone called Wamba Diawamba. Zimbabwean students often gave themselves name of iconic African politicians. So we have people like my friend Job Wiwa Sikala, who is known as Wiwa from the name of the Nigerian icon Ken Saro-Wiwa. And so he's called Nelson Wamba by his supporters, affectionately called so. He's the useful new opposition leader. And I say there are other candidates. For the first time, Zimbabwe has about 23 presidential candidates. Very often, we often have about 4 to 6 candidates in a presidential election. This time, we have 23. And I'm calling them, they might not like it, the spoilers. I don't think that any of them has a chance of winning, but they have a chance of making enough of a dent in the fortunes of the main two candidates. And then, of course, we've got the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, which is the major, which is the electoral referee. I call it the controversial referee because there's a lot of concern over the role they are playing. And then, of course, the voters, who are the deciders. The generals, whom I say the kingmakers, and I carefully put a question mark on that, because some people may feel that they are not, others may feel that they are. They were certainly very critical in installing Emmerson Mnangagwa as the president in 2017 and removing Mugabe. So they do have an important role, and they could still have an important role in the coming election. The international community, again, I put the certifiers, and again, I'm very careful to put a question mark there because some people may agree with it, others may disagree with that position. But the point I say is that the most important issue in Zimbabwe's election right now is legitimacy. The current establishment is very keen to get legitimacy. And they fear that if they don't get legitimacy, if they don't get endorsement from the international community, and in particular from the West, then they will have difficulties in being able to move forward. So they are very keen to please, especially the Western countries, the United Kingdom, the European Union, Canada, Australia, the USA. And so they have this role, rightly or wrongly, as the certifiers. If they say the election was free, fair, and credible, then Zimbabwe will be on its way under Emmerson Mnangagwa if he wins. If they say that the elections were not free and fair and credible, then I think Zimbabwe may continue to have the same challenges that it has been having over the past 20 years. And then we have China and Russia, and I call them the all-weather friends. Russia and China have a long history in Zimbabwe. They supported the liberation parties in the 1960s and 1970s when Zimbabwe was fighting for independence, and the bonds go deep. They go to that era. They have continued over the years. Whenever Zimbabwe was facing challenges, even sanctioning or issues at the United Nations, China and Russia would always come to their aid. And so they are an important factor. Of course, they don't do it because there is no free lunch in this world, isn't it? They also do it because they've got interest to protect. Now, Britain, the godmother, question mark. Zimbabwe was a British colony. And so Britain has been an important player over the years. For many years, until about 2013, Britain was very partial to the opposition, supportive of the opposition, of the democratic movement, civil society and all. But after that, there's been a gradual shift with Britain seemingly being more comfortable with the government, and in particular with the faction that was led by Emmerson Mnangagwa, which is now in charge. And a lot of people feel that, in particular, the current ambassador of the UK in Zimbabwe, there is a perception that she seems to be betting on behalf of the regime. And I say not because this is what I think, but this is the perceptions that I see and that I hear from people as they engage on these issues. May be right, it may be wrong. The United States of America, the skeptical eye, there hasn't been much to be said, but I think that there are certainly indications that there is no definitive point that has been reached at this particular point in relation to where Zimbabwe is. And I again put all these things in question marks. Southern African Development Community and the African Union, I call them the old comrades. The old comrades because these are the friends of Zimbabwe for many years, from the time of fighting for independence to the time of independence. And they've always played an important role. They supported the government of national unity, which was created between 2008 and 2013. The November coup and its implications. Now, as I said, when we talk about the role of the military in 2017 and how it played an important part in the removal of Mugabe, we must not forget that the military had already played an important role in 2008 in keeping Mugabe in power at a time when he was facing defeat against Morgan Tsvangirai. And so we go back to 2008. There's an operation that was called Operation Makavotera Papi in Shona. It means Operation Who Did You Vote For? So what happened in 2008 is that on March 29, 2008, there was an election which was generally free and fair, as most people say, and peaceful. And Morgan Tsvangirai won that election. However, it took more than a month before the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission announced the results. And a lot of people feel that during that time, the results were being cooked in order to make sure that Mugabe got a second bite of the cherry. And then he did, because there had to be a runoff election, which was going to be held in June 2008. But between that period of the first election and June 27, there was untold suffering and untold misery among the people of Zimbabwe as the ruling party, and some say with the military backing, there was this operation where many people were killed, many people were injured, many homes were destroyed, that the election that was held in June 2008 was really a sham election. And in the end, there had to be a government of national unity, which was brokered by the Southern African Development Community. And so the military had already played a role before 2017. And that role was to ensure that ZANU-PF did not lose power. that Mugabe remained in power. And in 2017, when Mugabe was losing grip, when another faction in ZANU-PF believed that they were going to be removed, and Mugabe had actually fired Emmerson Mnangagwa, who was the leader of the other faction, they decided that they had to take power away from Mugabe, that they had to change things. This was about survival. This was about protection of interest. And so there was a coup, which essentially got rid of Mugabe because there was a fear that Mugabe's wife, young Grace Mugabe, who was beginning to show a lot of power in the last 2-3 years, they had to go. And so it was called Operation Restore Legacy. Essentially, it was an operation to install Emmerson Mnangagwa and his faction in power. Now, the question that I'm asking today is what happens on July 30? Is it Operation Restore Legitimacy? Because there is no legitimacy at the moment. All legitimacy is very weak or tenuous. Is it going to be Operation Restore Legitimacy? Or is it going to be Operation Retain the Crocodile? In other words, how is the military going to play it up in the next few weeks? We've already seen, like I said, last week, the military issued a statement in which they said their actions are going to be guided by the Constitution. And I've already given you a reason why that statement itself is ambiguous. And Alex is going to speak a little bit more about the military. But the issue here is that being guided by the Constitution is not very helpful because we've already seen that they can interfere in politics and still claim that they are guided by the Constitution. I like these two set of pictures. Just if you look at them, if I was having a class, I would have asked people a question: what is the compare and contrast those questions, those two pictures? But yeah, on the left or on the right is Robert Mugabe. That's your left, right? Robert Mugabe. And on the right is Emmerson Mnangagwa. Now, they are not the most important people. The most important are the ones behind them. The one behind Robert Mugabe is a policeman. So Mugabe had his security. He was always a policeman. The one behind Emmerson Mnangagwa is certainly not a policeman. He's a soldier. This has changed. Many people may not have noticed it, but this has been a discernible change. During the coup, the police was immobilized. The police was seen to be on the other side or supportive of Mugabe. The military was supportive of Emmerson Mnangagwa. The trust, the protection that he's getting it from the military. I just love the contrast between those two because it demonstrates to us the narrative that has changed over the past 12 months. From the Mugabe with the normal police behind him and Emmerson Mnangagwa with clearly the military behind him. It's almost like a constant reminder to the audience that behind Emmerson Mnangagwa there is the military. But ZANU-PF and military ties have always been there. I think it's important to understand the history and where it comes from. The legacy of the liberation struggle. When ZANU-PF was fighting for independence in the 1960s and 1970s, they had an army, a guerrilla army, called ZANLA. The other party called ZAPU had a guerrilla army called ZIPRA. Now, these two merged and became part of the National Army at independence. But they retained their connection to their parties. They are comrades. They are people who were fighting together. They are connected in that way. So when we see the military backing or supporting ZANU-PF, it's also partly because of Zimbabwe is still a young country. These people share, this background. Protection for past atrocities. There have been a lot of things that have happened in Zimbabwe, including Gukurahundi in the 1980s, including Operation Murambatsvina, where homes were destroyed in 2005. In 2008, I've already spoken about the political violence that took place between March and June 2008. All those things, the people who did them are still there. There are people who are still in control. There are people who are in power. And to try and take them away from it, they fear, of course, that they may be prosecuted for those things. So that's an issue that continues to come up from time to time. The victims, the survivors are still there, and they are raising questions about it. Then there is elite convergence for both protection. the political and military elite has amassed so much wealth over the past 20, 30 years. The diamonds in Marange, one of the wealthy zones that we had over the last few years. But there's much more. And removing them from power also threatens the hold on this wealth. And then, of course, finally, you could also give them some credit and say there is ideological unity between the military and the politicians because of the shared history of the liberation struggle. The connection between the coup and the election. As I said, November 2017, it was a military-driven political takeover, but interestingly, it was justified on the Constitution. But it was not only justified on the basis of the Constitution by the military. One of the judges in the High Court actually issued an order which said that the military actions were constitutional. And so it created a precedent which still exists today, that if the military wishes to intervene, they can always point to the court judgment and say, well, the court allowed us to do so. So there is that issue. What about July 2018? As I said, the military has said it's guided by the Constitution. I won't repeat that, but I've already given you the reason why there is that connection. If they are guided by the Constitution to do what they did in 2017, they can do the same thing in July 2018 or afterwards. The ambiguity of the declaration itself, and of course, there are questions being raised about the role of the military in this election. For example, transportation of ballot materials from the command center to the polling stations and the results and all that. The military, if it is involved, people are raising concern. What will the military do? Are they going to sit back and let the government they installed 7 months ago lose power? Or are they going to stand up and fight for it? There have been positives in the last few months. We have to give that. The political climate and the political freedoms have expanded in a way that was not present during the Mugabe era. As I said, we demand free and fair and credible elections. These are people, MDC people, opposition people, demonstrating in the election, for elections. This used to be prohibited. There would be a clampdown by the police if these things were happening during the Mugabe era. Things are happening now in a way that was not there before. There's been a public commitment to peace by the president, which I think is a positive thing. The call to bring in international observers, I think, is a positive thing. It's good for people to see what's happening in Zimbabwe, to be open about it. I think there's a lot of regular engagement between the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission and the opposition parties. They've also signed a code of conduct and a peace pledge. The military statement might be seen as a positive in that perhaps it says that the military is not going to intervene, but that's if you want to be benevolent. Then, of course, while there are still repressive laws, those repressive laws are not being applied at the moment. But, as I talk about it, the fact that these laws have been maintained is in itself a very bad sign. It's not good. They should have been removed. And these are what we call low-hanging fruits. They could have been easily removed. These are the contentious issues. The lack of independence by the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. There's a belief that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission is disposed or is more inclined towards the ruling party. Just in fact, yesterday, there's been a huge outcry among Zimbabweans because they woke up looking at their mobile phones and they were receiving text messages from ZANU-PF and the president of ZANU-PF saying, would you please vote for us in elections? And so people are asking, how did you get our numbers? And the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission was very quick to say, no, it's not us. Maybe it's the mobile phone companies. The mobile phone companies have said, no, it's not us. So the question right now is, who did it? Who gave them that information? But this information is so clear, it's so constituency and ward specific that it could only have come from one source. Unless, of course, there are some people who are clever who say, oh, they did these algorithms or whatever they did, and they are able to identify who is voting in which constituency. I don't think that ZANU-PF has that capacity. And even if they did, I think that they had the actual information from the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, the numbers and so forth, in order to target these people. Refusal to audit the voters' roll. There are issues being raised right now about the voters' roll, and I think Alex is going to say a few words about the voters' roll and some of the challenges that we are facing. And Zimbabwe Electoral Commission has a power to create new polling stations. Now, people have to know where those polling stations are, because you see, people fear that this is where ballot stuffing takes place. If you don't know where the polling station is, that's where people are going to stuff the ballots. So there are a number of contentious issues. I won't go into each and every one of them. But I just want to mention the issue of traditional leaders, because a lot of people here may not have an understanding of how this works. In Zimbabwe, there are traditional leaders, chiefs, headmen. These people have got a lot of authority, not just power. They have a lot of authority in their local communities. People listen to them because of the cultural authority that they can exert. These people, unfortunately, they tend to be pampered with gifts. They got a lot of stuff in the last few months. The government bought the chiefs big, nice motor cars. And they promised them more gifts. And so, of course, they believe that their fortunes are attached to the ruling party. And they have power, they have authority, they have control, which they can use in order to influence how people behave in those elections. People went to court and said the chiefs should not declare their support for ZANU-PF. And the court said, yes, this is wrong. But the chiefs decided not to obey that order, waited until the last possible day of compliance, and then made an appeal to the Supreme Court. So that appeal is not going to be heard until after the election. So it means that they can just choose not to comply. And this is what I mean when I say sometimes I try to demystify the law, because they will tell you, oh, everything is according to the law. But you know, the law is being used in order to achieve a political purpose which is not fair. What about the international community? I've already pointed out the issue of whether they should be certifiers. I think China and Russia are playing an important role. Some people suspect that they are actually having more specific technical assistance for the ruling party. The UK has been important, and there's a fear among the opposition and civil society that they are betting, like I said, for the ruling party. I think ZANU-PF is trying to call the US, is trying to call the US and the international community to say, look, we are good guys, we are going to be good guys, we are going to change, we are going to make things better. But I think there's still a bit of skepticism on that score. The EU has been skeptical of the issues. The one point that I just want to refer to is the test that will be used to judge the election in Zimbabwe. Is it going to be what I refer to as the absence of violence only? In other words, if there is peace, does it mean that Zimbabwe's elections are free, fair, and credible? Or is it what we would call the absence of violence plus? In other words, you look at the issue of peace, but you also look at the other technical aspects of the election to consider whether the election is free and fair. The first standard, in my view, is very low, says the bar law. ZANU-PF already knows that a violent election is going to be illegitimate. So they're not going to be as violent as before. But they could do other things, where then you have to look at the absence of violence, but you also look at the voters' roll, you also look at the behavior of the media, you look at the behavior of when I talk the media, I'm talking the state media. Then you also look at the behavior of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, the referee. Are they doing what they're supposed to do as impartial referees? And there are so many other factors that you've got to consider, I think, in judging. My fear is that there could be this view that this is Africa. If there's no peace, then that's okay. We move on. And the other democratic aspects may be forgotten. That may be an issue. So the key questions are, how will ZEC's conduct and performance affect the election's credibility? My fear is that ZEC itself right now is probably the most difficult impediment, the biggest threat to the election, because their behavior is threatening the credibility. And I don't even think that it's in the interest of the current president, who is seeking legitimacy, that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission is behaving as it is doing. How will the military react to ZANU-PF defeat? I think that's an important issue. What are the prospects of an uncontested and legitimate election? I think that the election, whichever way it goes, is likely to be contested. If ZANU-PF and Mnangagwa win, I think the opposition are going to contest it. If the MDC, the opposition wins, I think that there could be elements within ZANU-PF who may not be happy with that, and they may also contest it. So I think that's an issue that needs to be looked into. And then, of course, I'm talking about the prospects of the government of national unity. And here, let me just put up a slide. This is from the Afrobarometer survey, which was undertaken at the end of April and beginning of May. And as you can see, the results is that ZANU-PF may get 42%, the ruling party. MDC-T, which is led by Chamisa, may get 30%, and the others have very little that they may get. But there were those who refused to answer, about 19%, which suggests that there could be a huge swing there, either in favor of Mnangagwa or of Chamisa. However, these results may indicate that we are headed towards a runoff election. In other words, there may be no conclusive winner on 30 July, which means that there would need to be a runoff election which is set for 8 September, should that be necessary. And so the scenarios that I've posted here are that maybe the crocodile, Mnangagwa, may win outright with a 2/3 majority, or even with a simple majority in parliament. This is a possibility. The second is that the crocodile wins, but ZANU-PF loses the parliamentary vote. I think there's a lot of focus, this is what I've observed in this election, on the presidential part of the election, but less on the parliamentary part of the election. So I think everybody knows that the key to power is the presidency. So it is possible that Mnangagwa may win, but he may only win, and his party may lose the parliamentary majority. It will be difficult to govern. That means that might lead to some kind of government of national unity. The third is Wamba wins MDC. Many people think that maybe this is not possible. 2/3 majority for the opposition. It's the first scenario, but for the opposition. And the fourth is the second scenario, but for the MDC. Many people did not give the MDC a chance way back in February. But I think that over the last few months, there has been sufficient demonstration of the will and the capacity among the people that if the election were free and fair, it is not an impossibility for the opposition to win. And finally, if there is no clear winner, that would warrant a runoff election. It is very possible that going forward, Zimbabwe may go through the route of consensus, perhaps go back to where we were between 2009 and 2013. I don't know how much appetite there is between the parties for that, but that is not something that should be ruled out given the politics that have played out over the years. My final recommendations are that, number one, you should provide observation for the entire electoral process. And I think I'm happy that there is a lot of observers that are already in place, observing the election. I think it's important to incentivize ZEC and to put pressure on it, incentivize them being polite. I think there's need for pressure on ZEC, and that is why these demonstrations are taking place by the opposition. It's political action in order to push the referee to behave, to be fair, to be impartial, to do at least what a referee should do. There's a view that the top military generals must reassure the nation and the stakeholders. They were the ones way back in 2002 who said the presidency is a straitjacket and that persons who support the liberation ideology should be the ones who take power. They should be the ones to say, no, we're not going to do that. They sent a PRO officer last week, but I think that that was not enough. The use of the absence of violence plus as a test for credibility, I think is critical. The view of elections as one part of a broader part of the democratic process is, I think, something that needs to be considered by those of you who are working with civil society organizations in Zimbabwe and indeed elsewhere in the world. Ensure that there is respect for the electoral outcome, preventing another coup. Like I said, remember what happened in 2008. Remember what happened in November 2017. Always be on the lookout that this could happen again. And as I said, you need to move towards more consensus building for peace and stability and development, and promote long-term entrenchment of democratic norms. If we go back to the beginning, autocracy and stasis or democracy and change, I think that we are at a very difficult moment for Zimbabwe, a critical juncture. Zimbabwe could continue on the path of autocracy and stasis, or it could go towards democracy and change, and indeed development. Zimbabweans themselves, we are the ones who are going to make that decision, but we also need the support, we need the goodwill of the international community in assisting us in what is an important moment of transition. I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Alex. That was great. You've given us so much to think about and discuss, but we're going to first turn it over to Alex Noyes to give us his reaction to the presentation and to add a little bit more context and respond to some of the questions that Alex Magaisa raised.
Great. Thanks, Natalie. Appreciate it. And thanks, Alex, for having me here. It's always a pleasure to be on a panel with the authority. So, in the interest of time, Alex covered everything, so we're all set, right?
I'm sure there's more.
But I think I'll speak a little bit about the role of the military, a little bit about the prospects for a government of national unity, and then I think I'll end with some recommendations, and then we can lead into the Q&A. So I was in Zimbabwe in May, and previous to that, the last time I was in Zim was for about 6 months for my PhD research in 2015, and it was fascinating to be back. Post military assisted transition or coup or whatever the language is, things really did feel different. You know, there was freedom to campaign. There were a variety of openings that didn't exist when I was there. I was actually in country during the 2014 ZANU-PF Congress when Mujuru was booted out of the country, out of the party rather. And I was actually trying to interview ZANU-PF officials at the time. And it was a very dicey period for anyone in the ZANU-PF party to be meeting with a white American. So I ended up just meeting with the MDC folks. And I came back 3 months later. But everyone was willing to talk to me then because they had already, factions had split off from each other. And it was a fascinating time to be there. But things had really changed when I went back as part of a pre-election assessment in May. But a lot of things had also stayed the same. So on the military front, you know, most people that we spoke to accepted that the November 2017 intervention was a military coup. But it was one that the international community accepted, or in the words of one civil society activist, sanitized. That said, much of the civil society and the public seem to have welcomed this action. And this is supported by the Afrobarometer data that Prof. Magaisa has referred to. So our meetings and the public polls suggested that they largely supported the military intervention. On one hand, according to Afrobarometer, 41% said it was the right thing to do, and the same proportion, 40%, said it was wrong but necessary. So that's a big chunk of the Zimbabwean electorate there. But on the other hand, Zimbabweans do not want military rule. So 7 in 10 Zimbabweans, 71%, reject military rule. And an almost equally strong majority, 68%, say the military must stay out of politics completely. So it's a really interesting findings there that complicate the electoral environment. But in our meetings, it was certainly the case that the military looms large. They are the elephant in the room, as Alex referred to. Many said that the coup opened the door to further military intervention in domestic politics, and this is highlighted by the ascendancy of former military leaders to influential positions such as the vice presidency, the foreign ministry, and the lands ministry. So our meeting suggested that the military is very much on the ascendancy post-coup and in the run-up to the election. And they continue to play an influential role in the economy as well. So hanging over all these discussions was the question of whether or not the military will respect the outcome of the election. And you know, it was really interesting to see this July 4 press conference. Alex called it ambiguous, I agree with mostly everything Alex says, but I thought it was actually quite clear statement to those who were paying attention that the military can intervene whenever they want. Guided by the Constitution is ambiguous, but the message was quite clear, I thought, and quite chilling. There were some really brave and excellent questions asked by the journalists in the room. The statement itself didn't include anything about respecting the outcome of the election, but some really sharp journalists pushed repeatedly on that. And the ZDF colonel looked a little uncomfortable, and he kept repeating back to his talking points on guided by the Constitution. So I think that's quite worrying. Folks that we spoke to on the ground, they said, these guys did not come to power in November to lose an election 8 months later. And 41% of the public say that it's somewhat very likely that security agencies won't accept election results. So again, I think that's a really worrying situation. We sat down with the foreign minister when we were there, and he said that Mnangagwa and Chiwenga have both insisted that they will respect the outcome of the election. And he also communicated that the ZDF commander, Sibanda, told a SADC delegation that he would do the same. However, when we pushed him on whether or not he would support a public statement to that effect, he said this would actually put the military back into politics. So this was testing our poker faces in that meeting. But he must have changed his mind, because then they had the July 4 meeting. I think this conference on July 4 was an opportunity for the military to clear the air, to retract previous statements of partiality towards the ruling party, and to commit to respecting the outcome of the elections. And it actually did none of these things. The fundamental question of respecting the outcome was not addressed at all, head on. So this is worrying. As Alex said, this leaves the door open to November 2017 type intervention under Section 212 of the Constitution, protecting the nation. So I'm going to say a little bit about the prospect of a government of national unity. I spent a good part of my graduate studies looking at this question, so it's always fun to come back to it and engage. I think Alex made a really important point about the narrowing partisan gap, 42 to 31% now. I think a lot of us, as part of the delegation, there was 5 of us, went under the auspices of the Zimbabwe Working Group. And all of us sort of expected to go in and see ZANU-PF as a well-oiled machine, and the opposition as a bit of a basket case. And we came back with those assumptions actually reversed. ZANU-PF factionalism certainly lives on, and we sat down with the main MDC alliance leaders, and they seem to be quite cohesive and working together. Better than I've seen in my decade or so of following Zimbabwe. So I think that narrow partisan, that narrowing gap is really something to track, and I think Afrobarometer has another poll coming out in the next week or two, so we'll have a better sense of what the actual feelings are on the ground when that comes out. But I would imagine it might have narrowed even further. So as Alex suggested, this says that a first round victory for either party is actually quite unlikely. Of course, 26% said refused to answer or said they didn't know, so that's a huge chunk as well. But I would say that the chances of another GNU are actually quite high at the moment. There are rumors on the ground that Mnangagwa actually wants a GNU, and I think maybe Alex can speak a little bit more about this, but I've also heard that Chamisa might be open to that as well. Now, I think the military question also looms large here. Will the military allow a GNU? You might think no, but at the same time, I get the sense that SADC and international actors won't sanction another coup again. So that might open up the option of a GNU if it does look like ZANU-PF might face an electoral defeat. So 34% of Zimbabweans, according to Afrobarometer, think that it's very likely or somewhat likely that the parties will agree to a GNU. And given my past research, I think there are a couple lessons from the 2009-2013 period that would be valuable for international actors and the parties to think about if that scenario does arise. So I think when I look back on the 2009 2009-2013 GNU, I know, Alex, you were part of it, so please don't take offense, but I can be quite critical sometimes of some of the decisions made during that period, both by domestic parties and by international actors. So on the one hand, it was an economic success. We had a new constitution, which was a fantastic development, which Alex basically wrote. And it opened up the space for some political breathing room. But it also allowed ZANU-PF to recharge, take credit for these successes, and the MDC really flagged during this period. They ignored the grassroots structures and made some strategic mistakes, especially on engaging with the military, or not engaging, I should say. So 3 main recommendations, I would say, if a second GNU comes about, that would help put Zimbabwe on a democratic path. One, again, the military question is critical here, even more so than 2008. So there must be something in a GNU agreement how to tackle this question, the military factor. And then in the content of the agreement more broadly, I think if you look back at the GPA itself, it can be quite vague, especially on items of spelling out detailed reforms and timelines for such reforms, and an external, any sort of enforcement mechanism, I think, was quite lacking. When I sat down with Morgan Tsvangirai in 2014, he said one of the biggest regrets and biggest mistakes of the GPA was to have JOMIC, which was the domestic implementing mechanism, as opposed to an external enforcement mechanism. So I think those are 3 things that are really important if we do get to that scenario. And I'll also say a couple quick points about recommendations on the military front, and then we'll move to the Q&A. So one thing that we found when we were there in May was that I think that the U.S. actually has more leverage than it's had in decades in Zimbabwe. It does seem that the current Mnangagwa administration is very keen on getting U.S. support, getting international support. And to be totally frank, the U.S. doesn't have a ton of strategic interest in Zimbabwe, and so it's some of our leverage has been flagged, especially with the sanctions already deployed. There weren't a lot of options for carrots and sticks there. So I think it's really important what the U.S. does over the next 3 or 4 weeks is going to be quite important. So again, to echo Alex, I think that insisting on an unambiguous public statement from the military and from Mnangagwa and Chiwenga that they'll respect any outcome of the election, and they should push to ensure that the military is not involved in any partisan electoral processes. Luckily, the Constitution is quite clear on all of this. Section 208 bans any military involvement in political processes. In the longer term, I think a cooling off period of at least a year would be a great start in terms of security sector reform in Zimbabwe. So in the U.S., we have a 5-year period where serving generals have to cool off from their active duty. I think that would be a good start that would help inoculate from coups moving forward. Strengthening parliamentary oversight of the security sector would be another good step. And I think we have, as unpalatable as it is, we have to discuss amnesties or guarantees if we're talking about how we're going to usher some of these generals or former generals off the stage. In Zimbabwe, they call them the securocrats. So I think that's, again, this is the critical factor underlying all of this and hanging over the elections. So I think I'll leave it there, and we can go to the Q&A.
Okay, great. Okay, a little bit more pessimistic about the role of the military, but at least you've given us some indications of what reform in that area might look like going forward. Thank you. Before we turn it over to the audience for questions, I think there's a factor in all of this that neither of you have touched on as much as I'd like, so I'll challenge you to respond to it. Your presentation's focused on kind of the elites, the parties, the military, the international community. So I'd like to hear very briefly some comments on what you feel the role of Zimbabwean citizens is in all of this. So something that we always try to be really careful about in this field is putting too much emphasis on an election as the catalyst of democratic change, right? But as you both brought up, it's a fact that the international community is watching these elections, and the ZANU-PF government, if they win, they're going to consider, the approval of the international community as their ticket to legitimacy. But what I'm wondering is the government interested in regaining legitimacy from the citizens? They're showing a lot of efforts to impress the international community, but what commitments, what proof have they shown to the people that they want to restore that social contract? And then second, just very broadly, what is the significance of this election at this point in Zimbabwe's history? How does this one feel different? So at NAD, we work pretty closely with civil society activists, and over the past few years, there's been a lot of new opportunities and challenges for them with the decline of the role and influence of labor through the tricky GNU politics, and now with more recent mass citizen protests and some apparent opening of political space. So maybe Alex, since you have been on your balcony, as you call it, since you've been watching from the balcony, looking down at the dance floor the past few years, how have you interpreted all of these changes and the citizen movements? And do you see an opportunity for citizens to bring about change? And also feel free to address those questions.
Okay. Thank you, Natalie. And thanks, Alex, for complimenting with that excellent presentation. Now, on the issue of citizens, you're quite right. I think we often take for granted the fact that at the end of the day, the election is an election that is supposed to be held by the people of Zimbabwe, the ordinary people. I guess in my concluding remark, I did mention, perhaps in passing, that the decision is for the Zimbabwean people, and that we need the support, of course, the support of everybody who has an interest in what's going on in Zimbabwe. I think that the biggest challenge, today, those of you who follow my social media life, you probably know that I tweet quite a bit. And today I was tweeting on the issue of the authority to govern. And I said, we were very deliberate when we were writing the Constitution. And I remember this because these are suggestions that we were making. And we say that we need to make it very clear to those who are in charge that the authority they have derives from the people. So our Constitution has got 3 clauses. One which says authority of the executive derives from the people, the authority of the judiciary derives from the people, the authority of the legislature derives from the people. And there's a reason for this. It was to remind politicians that whatever they do, whatever power they exercise, it derives from the people. And what it means is that the people can decide to take it back. They can decide to withdraw it. And when people demonstrated in November 2017 to get rid of Mugabe with the support of the military, we wrote reminding that this is the justification, that people can withdraw that authority if they wish to do so. So that was a constitutional sort of justification of the demonstration. Then it's the same point that we are making now, that the Zimbabwe Electoral Authority does not act in a vacuum, that the power they have is a power that is derived from the people, and therefore the people can decide to withdraw it. So yes, they are absolutely important in all this. One of the things that has stopped them from exercising their role as the authority givers and takers is the repression that has been in place, the repressive laws, the repressive machinery that has kept them locked in and unable to exercise their power to either withdraw or to confer authority. And so the elections have not been free and fair, and so there have been laws which have kept them at bay. And so the view is that there should be voter secrecy, there should be guarantees that people are able to exercise free choice. You might not see it, but when a person who is in a rural area opens their phone in the morning and they see a message from the president saying, "Can you please vote for me?" It actually sends a lot of messages. It sends a message that perhaps they know who I am, they know where I am. They might even see how I'm going to vote. You see, so there are more difficulties than, people say, oh, it's an invasion of privacy and all that. That's important, yes, absolutely important. But the more difficult issue in this election is that people will feel that their ability to make their free choice is being watched. I call it the panopticon effect from Jeremy Bentham and the panopticon, that someone is always watching you. And that is the difficulty with that kind of behavior. So I think that people have power, have authority, but I think they continue to be stifled in their ability to exercise their free choice. What is different about this election? I think that, like I said, it's an election coming at a time of transition in Zimbabwe. This could be a period of transition if it goes well, allowing Zimbabwe to move away from the Mugabe-dominated era. But remember, Mugabe was just a person. Mugabe was not the system. The system that he created is still there. The people have changed, but the system remains. But there could be a chance to transit from that to a new era for Zimbabwe. It's the first election without Mugabe and Tsvangirai as candidates in 20 years. The acrimony and the animosity that was there in previous elections is not quite there at the moment. I think there is a lot of respect and understanding between the different parties, which I think is a good thing. So I think that there is an opportunity for Zimbabwe to transit into a new era, but this requires people to be able to exercise their rights without undue interference, and also the support of everybody who has an interest in Zimbabwe to see them through.
I think I'll just quickly add, just underscore the significance of these elections. You know, they really are landmark elections. As Alex said, it's the first time that we don't have Robert Mugabe and Morgan Tsvangirai contesting in a long time. And there's this freedom to campaign. The ZBC coverage of the MDC Alliance manifesto, I thought, was really intriguing and something you certainly wouldn't have seen in the past. The invitation of international monitors. So these are all really, really positive signs. But again, the repressive system stays in place. POSA should have been moved, and it wasn't, and it hangs over things for sure. I think I would just underscore as well that the elections should be seen as one very important step, but only one step in the recovery and democratization of Zimbabwe. And I think international policy and the U.S. policy specifically should certainly think about the broader context as well, regardless of who wins. I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Okay, we'll take 3 questions at a time, so raise your hand and wait for the microphone that will be passed around. There's 2. And please introduce yourself when you begin speaking.
Mark Plattner, Journal of Democracy. Thanks for 2 very excellent presentations. My question is, I think you both spoke about factionalism within the parties of the ruling party and the opposition. What about within the military? Are there serious splits within the military? And that brings me to another question that's related. Is it a conceivable scenario that the opposition is convinced that it should have won in a fair counting, but the ruling party is proclaimed the victor? Is there a prospect that there could be massive demonstrations? And if so, could the reliability of the military in putting down those demonstrations be counted on by the ruling party?
Anyone else? Just hand it to Carl.
Carl Gershman. Alex, too, spoke about the importance of the U.S. Is anybody paying attention here?
Okay, one more for this group of questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. I just wonder if you are talking only presidential election or you are talking also other elections from local, state, or their province. And when the voter fraud, it's not just whether the ballot has been counted right. It's whether they are giving somebody who are eligible, a good candidate, but they did not, or they deny your candidacy, or a voter who are eligible to vote, but they don't allow you to vote. This is a totally different issues. And then after the vote, we are talking about electronic voting or paper ballot voting. And then we are talking about not just you vote or they count a vote for you, but it's just whether there's a hacking or manipulation, or they change the box or the whole votes. So whether you really pay attention to each of them before you say that it's a vote and that is the result.
Okay, we'll start. Go ahead.
Thank you for the questions. I'll start with Mark's question on factionalism. I would lie if I say that I know for a fact that there are issues in the military. I don't think that we have enough information. We were very wrong in November. Many of us, I think, analysts and commentators, because we did not actually see that the military would intervene and do a coup. We all thought that Mugabe was so powerful and so in control of the military that they would never take him out. I think that there were conditionalities that perhaps if he had done something, such as other people say if he had removed Mnangagwa, maybe the military would intervene, which happened. But I would say that until the day that it happened, I did not think that it would happen. So I think on that one, it's very, very difficult. Information on the military is always very hard to come by. My view right now is that there are some people who think that the current military establishment is actually quite professional. In other words, the soldiers who have remained in the barracks. But there is a view that those who moved to government after the coup may still be wanting to assert their authority in the military. I mean, so for example, I'm told the current vice president, who was the leader, the commander of the army, of defense forces, he maintains his office, that old office that he used to use, and he's still at what we call defense house, and he's also the defense minister. He's not just the vice president, but he's also the defense minister, which gives him some control or some authority, at least civilian, over the military. So I don't know about the relationship between the boys who moved into government are now in suits and the boys who kept the uniform. I'm not sure about that one. On the issue of the US, Alex, perhaps you answer that, yeah?
Sure.
On the issue of the voters' roll and the voters' roll, and there are 3 elections. We call them harmonized election. People, some of my friends used to think harmonized is something to do with the niceness of elections. And I said, no, it's about they are held at the same time. So we have got the presidential election, the parliamentary election, and then the local authority election. But you know what? The election that really matters is the presidential election. That is the one that unlocks power. And that's where focus is. The parliamentary election is also important because if you don't get control of parliament, then you might have to find some coalition, even if you win the presidential election. Local authorities are useful, but they have really been relegated. They are controlled. We have a very powerful ministry called the Ministry of Local Government, which pretty much does what it wants with local authorities. So the key election is the presidential and followed by the parliamentary election. We don't have electronic voting. It's paper-based voting, normal physical voting. We have a serious problem with the voters' roll right now, which means that people may be precluded from voting on the basis that their names are not appearing on the voters' roll. I've received so many emails, so many communications from people telling us that they are registered or they registered to be in one constituency, but they've actually discovered that they are registered on the roll in a completely different constituency. So they may not be able to vote. And there are not only duplications on the voters' roll, but there are also clear manufactured votes. So for example, my name is Alex Tawanda Magaisa. I was born on the 9th of August, 1975. I've got an ID number. There is also another Alex. There will also be another Alex Tawanda Magaisa, born same day, same location, address. The only difference between him and I is that his ID number may start with 1, my ID number will start with 2. But it's exactly the same thing all throughout. So these are created persons on the voters' roll. They are not duplications at all. And that is a big problem. And these things are being uncovered. The evidence is there and is being shown. So those are some of the challenges that we have with the voters' roll.
Let me quickly address the splits in the security establishment question. I think it's a good one, and it's very tough to unravel, as Alex mentioned. But there has been some good academic research done in the past that talks about these splits. Miles Tendy did a piece in 2015 that talked about the split between the CIO, the intelligence organization, and the military intelligence. And I think those are fault lines that you can still see today, and we're not. It's difficult to understand exactly where the factions fall, but you can trace it back and see that there certainly were big disagreements there, which all played out during the coup, as we saw. So the police and the CIO have certainly been sidelined, as Alex mentioned, and the military is firmly in control in that regard. Splits within the military itself are a little bit more difficult to unravel, but the war veterans groups are also another area that has seen a lot of factionalization since July 2016, actually, previous to the coup. I don't know if Norma Krieger is here, but she wrote the book on the war vets, and so check out her work as well. In terms of the U.S., I mean, yeah, of course, it's a great question. When the 5 of us got back from our delegation, we met with a variety of different U.S. government actors, and I think we were actually quite pleasantly surprised by the degree that people seemed to actually care about Zimbabwe. So we went to the White House, we went to the Hill, Congress and Senate, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and we did some other public events. And so I think people are paying attention. Whether it's top of their priority list, I think is quite probably obviously no. But certainly people are paying attention. So I think we should be aware of that when we talk about Zimbabwe over the next 3 or 4 weeks, and do the most we can to help advocate for positions that are good for democratization in Zimbabwe in the long run.
Okay, I think we have time for one maybe slightly longer round. So I'll take 4 questions, and then we'll just have to end because we're coming to the end of our time. Nick.
Hi, thank you. Nicholas Cook from the Congressional Research Service. I talk about once a week to an MDC guy, calls me, gives me the latest. They have some real concerns about the voters' roll and about the printing and transparency of the ballots, which you mentioned. He's sometimes said, with these problems, there might be no election. And I say, does that mean you're going to boycott? He says, no. So there's no clear answer on what he really means by that. But what, in your views, are the options of the opposition if we continue to see real problems with the process? I also wanted to mention for the audience, there's a new report just released by OSISA, the Open Society for Southern Africa, and the Zimbabwe Democracy Institute on the presence of the military throughout Zimbabwe at the village level. I also had a technical question. In the past, it was the role of the police to transmit collated vote results. Do we know what the process is now?
Okay.
Who else has a question? Oh, Eppling. Back.
Thank you. My name is Ibilang Baslong. I'm with Freedom House. My question was related to the MDC opposition led by Nelson Chamisa, who has stated, I think a number of times, that there's a possibility that the MDC may not participate in an election. And something that may not necessarily have come out of both of you, Alex's presentations, is the scenario planning around that, whether if an election does take place without the MDC, what does that mean? And this is something actually that I think the previous question asker had posed, so I'm just jumping on that. If I can add something else, I guess, to that, in terms of factionalism within the opposition parties, how does the Coupe camp possibly affect Nelson Chamisa's chances? Is there any possibility that that may derail whatever likely or whatever small chance that they may have of coming out ahead in these elections? Thank you.
Okay, I think there was a question in the back.
Michael Croft, engineering. I'd like you to try answering the question from the perspective of people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Specifically in Zimbabwe, there is sort of a recent U.S. innovation in democracy, which is opposition partisans are comfortable tracking down government workers at dinner to disrupt. Is that a lesson learned that should be adopted in Zimbabwe? I mean, I imagine it would operate a little differently there, or maybe it's already in process. I'm sorry, I can't get your name. The Obama, the other side is the Obama innovation to weaponize the national security and tax collection agencies against the opposition. I'm naming Obama, but I'm not entirely certain if you would flip D to R for 8 years, it might be the other side. I mean, it's a new feature. It's a possibility to innovate. Is that a lesson learned that that Zimbabwe should pick up, or I mean, should they notice that we did that? And is that sort of okay? And the last thing is, both of you, it's sort of been roughly 2 years since Trump was elected, and many opposition partisans are really actively opposing any kind of peaceful transition. So does that mean you really shouldn't expect any kind of peaceful pull together?
Okay, thank you. Is there one more question? If not, we'll go ahead and let you respond to these three, and maybe throw in some closing remarks if you have any final words. There's one more question? Okay, sorry I didn't see you. Go ahead.
Norma
We'll add it to the
Krieger, I'm
batch.
just filling in. I thought there was a gap. I have read a number of newspaper reports on different groups of military people engaged in land invasions since November 2017. There was one yesterday or this morning as well. And I wondered if you had any comment on that. It's not necessarily military elite. I don't know. It's not clear.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Okay, so I think I'll answer Nick's question about opposition options. I think, you know, most of the academic research suggests that boycotts don't really have their intended effect. So I'm not sure if MDCA has read these in-depth studies, but I think they're aware in general that I think boycotts sometimes don't work. So I would actually be surprised if there was, I think, you know, I'll speak for myself, but I would be surprised if there was actually any boycott. I think it's too much of a historic election, too much of an opportunity. The partisan gap is narrowing. I would be very surprised if you didn't see the opposition compete. And in terms of the coupe effect, you know, I think she pulled 1% in the last Alpha Barometer. So that's, you know, it's 1%, but it's also 1%. So I don't see her as a real spoiler necessarily. I think Mujuru had a similar, maybe 1 or 2%. So, you know, she has the potential to peel off some of the ZANU-PF voters, perhaps. And so that's a little bit more of an impact. But in terms of the coupe effect, I don't see it very strong at this point. But let's see what the next Alpha Barometer cycle says. I think that there could be some interesting updates in there. In terms of glass houses, I'm not sure I quite understood the question, but I think we should support democracy and recovery, economic recovery in Zimbabwe, for sure, regardless of what's happening in our own country. And I think I'll leave it there and pass off to Alex.
Thank you. You are absolutely right that there are concerns about the electoral process, the ballot papers, the voters' roll, and various issues. But you know, I talk to Nelson from time to time, and Tendai, BT, and other colleagues, and they say, you know, Alex, when you talk to people, they think that we are crazy. and that we are talking about magic of the ballot paper and all that. But they say, look, we have information that we have been advised from the 2013 election about how these things happened. There is a clear concern about pre-marked ballot papers, that if you don't control or you have oversight over who is transporting ballot papers or how the ballot paper is being printed, the design and all that, people are very concerned. Just a small demonstration. We have 23 candidates in this election. In the past, we used to have like 6 candidates. So you would have a ballot paper with the face and all, and there would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This time we have 23. Now, those 23, you could have put them on a ballot paper from number 1 to number 11, and then number 12 to number 23. The design of the ballot paper, they decided to change it. At least that's what we are being told. Nelson Chamisa would have been number 2 on the ballot paper because of his surname, because that's how the names are listed on the ballot paper. Emmerson Mnangagwa, because of MN, he would have been down there somewhere. But because there are 23, they have designed the ballot paper in such a way that Mnangagwa is now at the top end of the second column. So, you know, it might seem very innocuous or very silly, but what it means is that it's very easy, if that is how it is designed, to simply advise your voters that you've got a lot of illiterate voters and go to the top end corner. That's the one you need. And so the opposition has been complaining that we need to have a role in the design and to understand the transparency of designing the ballot paper. These are small things that might not concern you guys here, but they are very important in the context of our elections and all that goes on. And of course, there are concerns that the ballot paper may be pre-marked and so forth, and that, you know, that science has been shown to be there. Whether this is the case, we don't know. But this is a concern that is being raised. Options for the boycott, I don't think that there will be a boycott. I may be wrong on all this, but I don't think that there will be a boycott. The election that could have been boycotted was the 2013 election, because we knew for sure that there were international actors and regional players who would have supported it. And at that time, the opposition leaders didn't take that option. I think there is a lot of concern over this particular one. With 23 candidates, they can always go to elections with the other 21 or 22. And they will say it was a free and fair election. The others decided to boycott. We all know what happened to Raila Odinga in Kenya and how things ended up after the boycott. So I think that that one is a difficult one. It may not, I don't think it will happen. What is happening, in my own opinion, I don't know, I can't speak for them, is that I think they are taking political action in order to push ZEC into behaving. And that's why you have a demonstration like tomorrow. It's also to demonstrate to the international community that the MDC, the opposition, does have local capital, that does have support, that have legitimate support, and that their concerns are legitimate. And I think the political route will probably continue to play out until election day, and perhaps afterwards. I think someone mentioned what could happen should there be a scenario where the opposition wins and the ruling party simply decides that to declare that they've won the election. Could there be demonstrations? Could there be issues? I think that the level of frustration and the level of belief among the people, which I have observed, both when I was home a few months ago and discussing and engaging with people on various platforms, is that people, I think more than before, they will try to defend the vote. It didn't happen in 2008, it didn't happen in 2013, but I think that it may happen this year. People are tired and they would like to see their will respected. Coupe effect, I think you've already mentioned that. Can I just mention, I know that our time is, we've run out of time. Can I just mention that the one person that we actually, and I thought that someone would ask the question, we didn't discuss, is the Mugabe effect. Because he may be out, but he is certainly not out of the picture. Right now, ZANU-PF, the ruling party, doesn't want anything to do with Mugabe. They are behaving as if he was not part of them for the past 37 years. They are disowning him. He used to be called Comrade Mugabe in the press, Now he's called Mr. Mugabe. When you see that happening, it means they're gradually throwing you out. But what they're trying to do, they're not only disowning him, they're actually putting him together with Nelson Chamisa. They are saying that Chamisa wants to bring Mugabe by the back door. In other words, Mugabe has become so bad to them that they must associate him with the opposition. Now, some people believe that Mugabe does have some support, especially in a certain region, the Mashonaland regions. They believe that there is a party that is connected to him. And some of those people are standing and supporting Nelson Chamisa. Whether or not they might have an effect in the election, it is yet to be seen. But I suspect that there is enough concern when you see the ruling party raising all these questions about Mugabe. I think there is concern that he might have an impact. So the old chap may be out, but he is certainly there causing some discomfort in political circles. Yeah.
Okay, and then there was the question on the land invasions. Did anyone have any insight on that recent land
On the land invasions, look, I think that what has happened in the past few months is that those who are now in power and who were ostracized before, they are also seeing new opportunities for rent seeking. And we know that there was a story about the wife of the vice president, former general, who took over one of the farms which is owned by a parastatal. So these things are going to happen, but it also points to the fact that the land question, which was not handled very well, over the past 20 years, continues to be an issue, and it is not yet fully resolved.
Right. Thank you. We'll have to end it there. Thank you, Alex. And Alex, we've been so lucky to have you here at this time in Zimbabwe's history to offer your analysis. And I think I speak for all of us that we'll be following your blog and your analysis going forward during and after the election. So please join me in thanking our speakers.